Let's say you have a game with a dialogue system and you need the NPCs to respond to the player with different lines depending on what has happened before. For instance, the first time you talk to them you say "hi" and they say "hi" back. The second time you say "hi", they respond with "why are you greeting me again?" How would you implement that? The obvious solution is to have a Boolean value somewhere that tracks whether you have said "hi" or not. But what if you want to do something more complex? More Booleans? Well, the more flags you have, the harder it is to keep track of them all. Let's say you have a shopkeeper. If you flirt with her, she will give you different responses than if you don't. But if you had previously flirted with her friend, she won't be receptive to your advances. However, if you hit on her friend after you had flirted with her first, she would turn hostile. And you can see where this is going. At some point, it becomes impractical to track that information using variables. Imagine trying to maintain that software. For this, I'm using the Adventure Creator toolkit, but the principles should apply for other implementations. To manage the complex system interactions in this game, I used a state machine approach. My first idea was to use an implementation of Petri nets to model the logic of the story. But then I found this GDC talk by John Ingold, which was simpler to develop than what I was trying to do. Give it a watch, the link is in the description. The following are the steps I used to implement his example. Unity has a state machine system built in, which is the animator controller. I used it, not for animation, but as a finite state machine for the logic of the story. I created an animator called S1 Wolf Quest. The name doesn't matter. I used S1 as a naming convention because it was going to be on my first scene. I created a state named Know Nothing, that it's going to be our starting state. Another state named Know About Wolf, another called Wolf Seen, Wolf Killed, and another called Wolf's Head Cut Off. And then I created some transitions to move us forward. Then I create some triggers. In this case, it's called Told About Wolf. How do I move from knowing nothing to knowing about the wolf? Well, someone told me. When someone tells me, this transition will trigger. How do I go from knowing about the wolf to having seen the wolf? Well, I have to see the wolf. This is an action. Doing this triggers the change of state. I also changed these settings to make the state machine behave more the way I need it to. Then it's time to connect this with Adventure Creator. I want to call the trigger from a hotspot, so when the player does something, it will tell the state machine to move to another state if it's appropriate. To use an animator controller from an action list, I need to have it on the scene. So I create an empty object called Story Container. Inside that, I create another empty object called Wolf Quest, and I add an animator component to it. And to that animator, I assigned the S1 Wolf Quest animator controller that we were using earlier. So, on the action list editor, while editing the action list of the hotspot we want, I set the action type as object and the action to call event. There, I drag and drop the WolfQuest object. Since this object has an animator component, I can go to the animator and select Set Trigger. This will ask us for a string. What do we put here? The name of the trigger we want that changes from one state to another in the finite state machine. When we run the game, we can see that the state machine is at one state. Then we click on the hotspot and it activates the action list, runs the node, which triggers the trigger, and the state machine goes to the next state. Finally, we repeat the process for every trigger. And that was basically the easy part. Asking the network which state it was in was a bit more difficult. But that's a topic for a future video. I hope this pseudo tutorial was helpful, and I'll see you soon. Hopefully.